Okay, I guess we gave everybody enough time to be a little bit late here tonight, so we're going to get started with our program. So the theme for Storm Surge this fall has been sort of about talking about adaptation. And our program back in September was dealing with storm preparedness, so in other words, being personally prepared and adapting to bad weather. And our program coming up in November is actually talking about retreat, which is moving away from a harmful environment, and we're talking about humans, of course. But tonight's program is going to be more focused on how nature is adapting and changing within the wildlife refuge at Parker River. So actually, I think Chris Zernick, is Chris here? Chris wanted to actually say something before I introduced Nancy Powell. You want to come up, Chris?
I didn't want her interrupted. So, of course, this is a pitch about and for Storm Surge. As many of you know, we are a nonprofit organization and we are all volunteer-based. Last year, we calculated that over 2,000 hours were spent in volunteer work for Storm Surge. In the past 5.5 years, we've offered over 65 programs. So this is an appeal. We do need some more volunteer help. We're especially looking for someone who can do coordination of volunteers and someone who might be able to do grant writing, or several of you who might be able to do both of those things, or if there's something else you would like to do, we'd be happy to have you on board. Finally, what I'd like to say is these programs do come to you free. We do have a donation jar. We don't expect $10, we don't expect $5, but if you'd like to put in $2 or $3, it would help us enormously defray a lot of the costs. So thank you very much, and we're so glad that you're here for tonight's program.
Okay, so let's get on with the program. I want to introduce Nancy Powell, wildlife biologist at the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge, for tonight's program.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to try to stay here so that I'm not behind the podium. Can everybody hear me fine? So just raise your hands if you can't hear me, okay? So as Mike said, I'm the wildlife biologist at Parker River Refuge, and I've been there for quite a while. I think this is my 18th year at the refuge. And because I've been there for so long, I've seen a lot of changes. I told people that I don't really get bored in my job because I think I've reinvented 3 times already. And lately, a lot of my work has been about change, and particularly change that comes as a factor of the climate impacts that you guys have all been talking about. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the change that's happening on the refuge. And talking about the refuge, I generally talk also about the Gray Marsh. So the refuge is about 4,700 acres. The Gray Marsh itself is about 16,000 or 20,000, depending on how you're counting. But it's all part of the same habitat and same ecosystem. So whatever I say for the refuge generally, kind of expands to both the natural and some of the human infrastructures that's surrounding the refuge. I also want to take a moment to say that a lot of the work I'm presenting is actually work by a lot of different partners that work in the Plum Island area. We're pretty lucky to have so much research and so many partners that work in the Gray Marsh. There's a lot of academic researchers that work in the Big Marsh, the big one being the Plum Island Estuary Long-Term Ecological Research Station. I think some of you guys know them as the Marine Biological Lab, the Rally House on Route 1. We also have a couple of other universities that do a lot of great work in the area. So in presenting the change and understanding the change that's happening on the refuge, I'm going to be talking about some of their work. And then in trying to address some of these issues, there is a coalition of conservation partners that have been working together for many, many years. So I'll be touching upon some of their work as well, or more of the collaborative work that we're working on. So being a coastal community, sea level rise is obviously a big issue for us. It's often the first thing people talk about when we talk about climate change. The current sea level rise in Boston is about 2.8 millimeters per year. I think when I started talking about climate change about 10 years ago, it was 2.3, and then it changed to 2.5. So the rate of sea level rise is actually changing, it's going up. That is not a steady line, it's more of a logarithmic line. Very quickly, I'm sure you guys know this already, but sea level rise is tied to climate change because a warming climate does two things. It warms up our oceans, which causes thermal expansion. So just like when you heat up water in a pot, you get more volume because the molecules are all kind of just moving that much faster and needs more room. You also get a lot of melting of glaciers and landlocked ice sheets, and that flows into the ocean and adds to the volume of the ocean. But we don't just have to worry about sea level rise. As the ocean warms, the ocean is actually kind of a thermal regulator for the Earth. It also means bigger storms, more frequent storms. And typically we think about tropical storms, they typically die when they hit about North Carolina because they hit our cold northeast oceans and they lose energy. With the warming oceans off our coast, some of these storms are not dissipating, they're actually carrying on. That's why we're seeing that bigger storms. It's same thing kind of on the land side. We're seeing a lot more precipitations, which means bigger discharges in the river and even more drought. So we're getting more extreme. So we're getting kind of weather storms, but we're also getting longer periods of droughts. So we're getting more extreme weather. And for those of us that's kind of in the way of this weather, it's that combined effect of a slowly rising sea level and those storm impacts that really we're most concerned about. The name of your group. One thing I also want to is worth mentioning is that being on the North Shore of Massachusetts, our geographic location also makes us more vulnerable. So we're part of Gulf of Maine, which is an incredibly diverse ecosystem that is a wonderful place to be. But it's also a very shallow area, this area that we're in, which means that the ocean do get warmer in the Gulf of Maine than other parts of the Atlantic coast, for example. And when we have storm events, those impacts can get magnified because it hits that shallow shelf in the Gulf of Maine before it hits us. So what does this mean for the Refuge and for Plum Island and for the Great Marsh? So when we look at climate threats, we kind of tend to talk about vulnerability. For the Refuge, that means the different habitats that we have on the Refuge. And vulnerability really can be kind of broken down to a couple different parts, right? So you have exposure, and that's your storminess, your precipitation, your sea level rise, like how much threat is coming towards and how often. You have the sensitivity of whatever it is you're trying to protect against that threat. Luckily for us, from a sea level rise standpoint, we actually have pretty low sensitivity because we have large tides, right? So we're in a macro tidal system. Our tides are 10 feet or more on a daily basis, which means that our habitats, our natural habitats is used, and a lot of our infrastructure is built for those big tidal ranges compared to Cape Cod or Rhode Island or down in the mid-Atlantic where they only have like 1 to 2 feet. So we actually have relatively low sensitivity from that standpoint. And then adaptability, how resilient or adaptable is whatever it is you're trying to protect. As you can tell, for nature, adaptability is actually pretty high. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's a lot of change, and that's why there's a lot of change that's happening. This last one is kind of interesting. As a natural resources major, a wildlife conservationist, you're always been taught that genetic diversity is good, and diversity is good. And you don't really like get to test why that is. You just accept it as a truth. Now I'm actually seeing in action why diversity is good, because forces of evolution is actually like playing out on the refuge every day. And that variability comes in really handy when you have these big extremes that happen. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the beach and dune habitat, and then I'm going to shift gears and talk a lot more about the salt marsh habitat, because that's what I've mostly been focusing on. So if you look at Barrier Island, the beach and dune habitat has a couple of different categories you can think about, right? So you have the beachfront and then the foredune, and the foredune protects the rest of the dune. So that's this one right here. And then you have the foredune and kind of the back dune. That's your beach grass and your beach heather and beach pea down here. And then in the back here, you have these swales, these cranberry bogs that a lot of people don't know is on the refuge. We have about 50 cranberry bogs in the refuge, and it is cranberry picking season if you are lucky enough to have a permit. Or there's, I think, one more public program coming up in November if you're interested in joining. And then in the way back, protected from all the storm forces, is our shrubs and our forest. And then behind that is the salt marsh. Conveniently, on the refuge, the road runs right through where the forest and the salt marsh habitat is. So it kind of divides the island in half. So far, most of the vulnerability and most of the impact has been on the beach and the foredunes. So we're seeing a lot more erosion and a lot more reworking of the beach and the shape of the beach in the last 10 to 15 years. I would say in the last 10 years, we've had to rebuild a bunch of our boardwalks. Our maintenance guy actually redesigned all our boardwalks because it was being washed out so often. So if you've ever been to Lot 1, you can see the new design that is more parallel to the ocean versus perpendicular to the ocean. Seems to be working pretty well. And of course, those impacts are a lot less than the north end of the island, where the consequences of erosion is pretty dire and is pretty well documented already. So on the refuge, we've been asking for a while, well, what's happening to the beach? Is the shoreline changing? Is it retreating? And if it is, what direction is it changing and how rapidly is it changing? So we've been doing these monitoring programs since 2011, and basically, we take a kind of high-grade GPS unit and just walk or ride ATV along this high tide line every spring and fall, and that kind of tell us where that shoreline position is on a bi-annual basis. And then you do it enough and you get a bunch of lines like this. You're like, that's kind of okay, interesting. You do some better analysis, and then you can start telling the story apart. So this is an example of 1 year's worth of data, and this tells the story beautifully of how in the summer, from spring to fall, we tend to have a period of accretion. So this is a time of year where we have gentle waves, we don't really have a lot of storms. So in general, the beach tends to accrete. And then from fall to spring is where we get our northeasters, we get most of our erosion. So this red is showing, different erosions in different areas, but for the most part, the beach is eroding. And then you combine them together. And for this 1 year, there was general westward beach erosion, but some areas with very little change. And then you do this a bunch of different years, and you get that variability. So these lines are now from year to year, so it includes that 6 months of erosion and that 6 months of accretion, so spring to spring. And you can see the first year, the shoreline actually moved east, moved west, didn't change that much, didn't change that much. And in the 5 years that's showing in this graph, there was actually a little bit of beach moving eastwards. And this, so it's saying it's not changing a lot, but there's a lot of change from year to year, and we see that. Another thing we wanted to look at is how is the shape of the beach changing, not just where the high tide line is, but so for that we take an even better GPS unit, and we walk a line from basically the road all the way to the beach to zero beyond low tide, actually. And we get a bunch of graphs, and so this tells us a little bit more information. So in this first graph here, you can see that if you were just looking at the beach position, it would say that there's no change, because that point is exactly the same, right? But in fact, there has been a loss of habitat, of beach sand from that area of the beach. Here's one here where it's actually eroding, so we're losing beach. And then here's one where we're eroding and then adding. So different sections of the beach do different things on a kind of annual basis. Well, what does this all mean? So Parker River, as you all know, is established for wildlife and specifically for birds. And the birds that's mainly using our beach are shorebirds, piping plover being the most famous. But we also have hundreds of thousands of shorebirds that come through from the Arctic in the fall and spring, and they feed on our beach in our salt marshes and other parts. So, and they're basically fattening up for the next journey of their journey. And a lot of this change, this more dynamic beach system, is actually been benefiting these birds in the near term because those storms are bringing on wrack, they're bringing in shells, which is nutrients and moisture, and it creates insect habitat for the birds. It's reworking this fore-dune, which is great for piping plovers because they don't like a lot of vegetation to nest in, so it's constantly being reworked. And our birds have responded really well. This is the piping plover nesting numbers, and this past year we have 50 pairs of plovers on 6 miles of beach. It's unheard of. People keep asking, how are they there? I'm like, I don't know, they just pack them in there. So the storminess, the increased storminess, at least in the short term, has helped some of these shorebirds. We don't know what the future holds, and that could still change. But I would say probably in the next 10 to 20 years, these guys are pretty good as long as we allow that beach to change. If we stop that, then these guys probably wouldn't respond as well. But if we allow that dynamic nature of the beach to change, the shorebirds will do just fine. I'm going to shift gears a little and go, I'm going to shift gears a little and go towards the north end of the island. So is there any questions on what I presented so far? Yeah.
Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
So for that whole time you have a record, was there always the beach closures?
We closed the beach in 91 right here.
Okay.
Yeah, so we went, I think when we went from like 2 to 5 pairs of plovers, yeah, and then we closed the beach. And, yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have you taken into account the contaminants coming from cities upstream from the report from the untreated sewage? Millions of tons of sewage are dumped into the Merrimack every year.
Yeah.
We don't even know Manchester won't
Yeah.
release those numbers to us, as you well know.
Yeah.
What effect does that, if any, have on beach erosion?
I don't know that it affects beach erosion so much, especially the sewage water, because that's kind of a bacterial, and we haven't monitored the bacterial concentrations on our beach to see if it's impacting the birds. The ocean is really large. I think we're kind of hoping that there's a dilution effect by the time it comes to our beach, because of the circulation.
But have you looked at any of the concentrations in the water to determine whether or not that is in fact the case?
We have not. I know some of the local watershed groups have done some, and some of the high school kids have actually been testing water, I think, for bacteria for swimming beaches. I think they had tested the north end of Plum Island. I'm not sure if they test like La 1 on the Refuge, but yeah. But again, that's something that the students do some years and not all years. I know there's efforts to start doing that, but we have not been monitoring that component. Okay, so moving to the north end of Plum Island, because this is where kind of the rubber meets the road, right? Because the Refuge is we're able to be flexible. So there's really not that much of an issue for us on the beach side, except that we're continuing to monitor what happens to see if it becomes an issue in the future. So I saw that Chris Hines is giving a presentation in December. I will try to come to hear that. You guys should too. He's a really good speaker and knows a lot about coastal geology of the area. So he did a NSF-funded project, a really large one, a couple years ago on Plum Island, focused on the north end of Plum Island. And one of his grad students, Andy Fallon, specifically asked the question, how is the beach shoreline at the developed portion of Plum Island changing? So those high tide line surveys I mentioned on the Refuge that we're doing with GPS units, the state of Massachusetts nicely went and digitized all those shorelines based on old aerial photos and topography maps way back to the 1900s. So that is all data that's online. And Andy took all those and put them on the map for Plum Island. And what he noticed was that most of those lines fell in this gray zone, which is what he called the steady state shoreline position. There was only 5 instances where he actually retreated west of that. So his theory is that unlike the classic kind of shoreline westward regression that is in the mid-Atlantic that have been shown in other studies, maybe Plum Island isn't regressing to the west, but it does vary a lot. So these houses, any houses that's over here obviously would be impacted by that. If you stay out of this zone, maybe you will be okay. Again, things are changing, but based on the last 100 years of history, this is what the shoreline positions are showing. He also did a lot of very detailed kind of cross-sectional surveys, similar to what we did, but a lot closer together to try to get volume of sand that's actually on the beach versus being moved offshore. And one of the theories he came up with was that, similar to a lot of other deltas, you get this big sandbar that's kind of almost half moon-shaped outside of the delta, and that's all the sand from the Merrimack River that's moving out. And then you have these long spits, sandbar spits off to the south of it because the ocean waves are moving it and shaping that. And as each storms hit, they will break through at different times, at different areas. So this break will move from year to year and month to month. I think he did the study in 18 months, and it did change during that time of his study. And when it breaks through, that's where you're going to have that force come against the island, and that's where you're going to have your erosional spot. And more to the fact, when we have these groins that were put in by the state, I think, years ago. And these groins, what it does is it basically magnifies that erosional force to one side of the beach or the other. So you can kind of see that here, and the sandbars moving over time. Here's another view of his surveys and the photo that goes along with this. So this had eroded. This was the erosional hotspot. And then the erosional hotspot, I believe it moved south of here, and it allowed this to build back up during his time of the surveys. So one other model that I'll mention, I know there's an Army Corps of Engineer model being worked on. I really don't have any details on that, so I can't speak to that. But for when Hurricane Sandy hit, a lot of the Great Marsh partners got together, and we were able to get 2 grants. And one of the grants funded a large hydrodynamics model for the region. We were focused on the salt marsh, but we also asked them to look at kind of the sediment transport on the beach side, specifically for those people at the north end of Plum Island. And it's not a lot of detail, but basically what the model showed was that based on wave energy and storms and predicted storms with sea level rise, most of the sand is getting deposited at the north end of the island, kind of near where our maintenance buildings are, and it's getting moved to the north, and it's getting moved to the south. That was the general trend as of 2016. I believe the data was based in collected in 2016. Again, these things can change because there's a lot of change happening out there, but that kind of does explain why the middle of the island is a little bit wider than either ends, because a lot of the sand is getting deposited there by the majority of the storm forces coming off the ocean. So now I'm going to shift gears to salt marsh. Does anybody have any questions before I move off beaches? Okay, so when you look at salt marshes, and most people look at salt marshes from the road because we don't allow people to go out in the salt marshes. The salt marshes look all uniform, right? It's green, it's grassy, they all look the same. But if you look closer, salt marshes actually have very different habitats and very different functions, especially if you're a wildlife trying to live in salt marshes. So we have these, what we call high marsh, or salt marsh haze, Spartina patens, this kind of cowlicky grass. It's usually dry, it gets flooded once a month. I describe it to people, if you want to have a picnic, this is the one you want to pick, because it's really nice, it's solid, and you can lie down, and it's breezy, and it's beautiful. Spartina alterniflora is the one that gets flooded every day, so it's really tall and big, harder to walk through. This is where your fish and your crabs and your mussels live. This is where your birds and everything else live. You also have big pools and then creeks that cut through the marsh system, and then tidal flats and other areas. And if you look at a cross-section of a salt marsh, the tide is really, really important in the salt marsh. Salt marshes live and die by the tide. And a feet or even a couple of inches of tide makes a huge difference in a salt marsh, what kind of salt marsh you get. In Plum Island, historically, for the last 400 years, we have the nice Spartina patent salt marsh hay, the ones you can picnic on. That's changing. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So this picture just illustrates the point that it doesn't take a lot to change what kind of salt marsh you get. But when talking about salt marsh, I always think that it's important to go back to the longer geological history, because if you think about Plum Island is really young. Plum Island only formed about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Before that, there was nothing. It was, the continental shelf, and the salt marshes actually formed about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So geologically speaking, we're in a very young area, but it's also only what, at least the Europeans, the people as we know it, knew of the system. And it's been pretty steady in the time that humans have known it. But salt marshes are living systems, and as the sea rises, salt marshes are capable of keeping up with sea level rise. So they do this in a couple of different ways. So they will build elevation as they get more flooding, and they do this in two ways. The plants themselves grow, and they bury a lot of that biomass into the peat. They also trap sediment, as you can see from this Spartina alterniflora photo, and that gets buried as well. As the marshes flood more uplands, the upland area should, in theory, change to salt marsh if the grading isn't too high and there's nothing there to stop it. We're also going to get more erosion on the edges as we get those more frequent storms. And that erosion is actually going to become the sediment that this marsh needs in order to keep up with sea level rise. And then with more storms, you're also going to have these tidal mud flats, and these banks are going to resuspend sediment. So the sediments, amount of sediment is actually going to change with climate change. So it will make it more available to the salt marshes. So I mentioned that the Marine Biological Lab, doing a lot of the work in this area. And one of the first things they noticed when they worked here was that with the Spartina alterniflora, the low marsh plant, it seems to grow at different rates in different years. And they're like, in some years they produce a lot of biomass, in some years they don't produce a lot. somebody decided to look at why, and they thought, that's kind of interesting. If it gets flooded more, it seems to grow better. So the years where we have more flooding or higher water levels, it seems to grow better. So I'm not sure who came up with this, but some really brilliant person designed an experiment. So this is called a Marsh Organ. It's basically a bunch of PVC pipes, and they planted the alternate flora in it. So this one here is getting flooded a lot. This one here is barely getting flooded. And as you can see, the one that's getting flooded a lot is really happy and is doing really well, and the one that's not getting flooded is very sad. So based on this work, Jim Morris is one of the researchers that's with Marine Biological Lab. He's based out of North Carolina, but Plum Island is one of his long-term sites. He kind of came up with this, what he called the marsh equilibrium model, and it's basically taking elevation of where these two plants grow in the marsh, as well as experiments like these pipe organs, and then these are what he calls marsh burrs. They're basically chunks of peat that gets thrown off in the winter and get taken somewhere else and get deposited. So he goes out and monitors them and see if they live or they did die. So they're like kind of nature's experiments. From all that work, he was able to construct these two graphs, which basically show that there is an elevational divergence between the two main plants that's out in the marsh. So this is the high marsh plant, Spartina patens, and this is the low marsh plant, Spartina alterniflora. At high elevations, the patens are really happy and they do really well. And then at lower elevations, the Spartina is really happy and they do really well. And where they meet, there's competition going on. And at some point, Spartina alterniflora or Spartina paten wins out, depending on how much flooding they get. So for Plum Island, this is where we were for 400 years. We were kind of on the right of the Spartina patens curve. Spartina patens is really happy. That's what was growing. We're not getting a lot of the other plants. We have now moved to, I don't know, somewhere on the other side of the curve. We're losing a lot of patens. We're getting more alternate flora. And as sea level rises and as we get more inundation, we will keep going. And we don't know. The big question is, how far will that go and how quickly, right? So we have a way to measure that, of course. This is a U.S. Geological Survey came up with this instrument called a sediment elevation table. So this rod that you see, this is a big rod that we drive into bedrock. We just keep driving it in with the jackhammer until we get resistance, and hopefully that means we hit bedrock. In some areas, it's 80 feet, 120 feet. Some of it can be quite deep. And then we secure it in place, and we use this arm to read it. Basically, this kind of gives us an elevation in 4 directions. So you can kind of see this diagram. We swing this arm 4 times, and we get 36 readings for this area. We also put what we call a horizontal marker down. We use pottery clay at the corners, and that tells us how much elevation has been accreted on top since we last came out to measure. So from these 2 measurements, we can actually look at accretion and subsidence of that same area. So we deployed a bunch of these on the Refuge years ago, and we noticed that for 2 of our sites, one was doing better than the other, and then they seemed to have this divergence going on. At this point, if you were to draw a straight line, one was just below, I think at this point, the sea level rise was like 2.3 still. So this one was barely keeping up with sea level rise, and this one was doing really, really well. LTER, or Marine Biological Lab, has a bunch of these as well, and they had them longer than we did. So when we looked at their data, they were finding the same thing. The low marshes were growing and keeping up faster than sea level rise, whereas the high marshes were just about sea level rise or a little bit below. They actually went a step further and plotted their marshes against the elevation, and this kind of repeats the story of Jim Morris's work, which was that at these higher elevations, you have the high marsh grass, the Spartina patens. They're pretty happy here, but they're not accreting really fast. At these lower elevations, you have the low marsh grass, the Spartina alterniflora, and they're accreting really, really fast. So those marshes are like, 2 to 3 times at the pace of sea level rise. So their theory is that this is kind of where we've been for 400 years. This is where we are now. We're getting more open water, and we're getting more Spartina alterniflora. And in the future, our marshes are going to look more like the Cape Cod marshes or the Rhode Island marshes, the marshes down south where you have more of the low marsh. And we're going to lose our kind of traditional New England salt marsh.
So you're going to basically lose all that habitat that you say the birds use for nesting. And
That is a concern, yeah. That's something we're looking into, definitely.
now, what about the perimeter of the marsh, right? So where the marsh effectively stops because elevation rises, and basically the marsh is surrounded by development.
Yeah.
So ultimately, that high marsh would like to move inland, but now it's moving into developed areas, so I see a conflict there.
There's definitely, where there's development, the marsh definitely will not move. There's actually higher potential for marsh migration, and I think we'd be surprised. I have a slide later that shows that the Northeast Massachusetts actually have some of the best potential for marsh migration compared to the rest of the state. Because we have marshes up here, and then Cape Cod has marshes. And if you think about Cape Cod, there's a lot of development on the edges of marshes in Cape Cod, so they don't really have a lot of areas to move, but there's actually still natural lands around some of our marshes that will be able to move. So on the refuge, we're obviously focused on quite alarmed by some of the changes that we've been seeing. A lot more inundation, a lot more Spartina alterniflora, a lot more algae. I don't know if you guys have seen the algae out in the marsh, more now than you've ever noticed before. We're also seeing a lot of this calving and erosion on the banks as we go around by our boats. So, when you're working in a marsh system, something I learned very early on when I came to the refuge was that when you do something in the salt marsh, the impact can last actually decades after you've done something. It takes a long time for something to manifest itself in a very complicated system in a marsh. So I was very cautious that anything we do, don't mess up the marsh any further. So I decided to start with something I knew very well about, which was one of the first restoration projects I worked on when I first got to the refuge. We were concerned about all these ditches that's everywhere. So the thought was that, well, if we kind of diked up the ditches and kept the water on the marsh, that'll create more fish habitat, it'll create more duck, shorebird habitat, it'll be good for everybody. So we created these berms with the help of mosquito control. And as you can see, we have a lot of open water and kind of that wet alterniflora marsh here. I started getting concerned about these probably about 8 years ago, and it's like, ugh. These don't really look like natural systems that's out there. Maybe we should do something. And then, looking at all the changes that is occurring and the trajectory of where our marshes are going, I finally decided that it was time to reconnect these areas and to take them out. So here's 2 ways that we are doing it. With the machine, just reconnecting that ditch or that creek. And this is actually replicated hand salt marsh haying tools that they used to use, a pea cutter and some shovels to remove. And so this is an aerial photo of what the area looks like before, and this is what it looks like afterwards. And I don't know if you can tell that it's a lot drier now, and the plants are coming back, but I have some photos too. So this is what the areas all look like. They were open water, we're losing peat and elevation in these open areas. As soon as we pull it, we get these mudflats and kind of rivers forming. And then after a year or 2, the vegetation comes back. This year, this area has completely revegetated, all of them have. So this past spring, I had done the permit the previous year with the data from our pilot study. I was able to get a permit to pull all these plugs that were put in on the refuge between Lot 2 and our sub-headquarters. So there was about 20 of them. And doing multiple of them, I was hoping to have some synergetic effects, specifically around the salt pans area. This area is probably the most visible. How many of you are birders? Okay, a few of you. So if you're a birder, you kind of probably notice the changes at the salt pans and the algae that's always growing there, right? So I was hoping that, if we pull a couple of these plugs out, that we would. So we pulled this plug out this spring, and then one up here in May. And so this is what the north end, this portion looked like, this bare spots with the pool expanding, and this is what it looks like just last month. So this has all revegetated. And then one thing that I hope will make the birders happy is that the water in the pool, in the salt pans, is now dropping and flooding again. The water had been held in there because there was a plug in the back, and it was getting deeper, and the birders were losing their shorebirds. There used to be shorebirds that show up all over the place, and the last 6 years, all they've been seeing was ducks. And I was like, yeah, that's probably because the pool's getting deeper. So now that we've done this work, the shallow areas are coming back. I'm hoping this will accrete in elevation, and that, the shorebirds will start using it again. So you cannot plug up a ditch. What are you supposed to do with them? Because we have a lot of them out there. One of my colleagues has actually worked with a private contractor that works out of Maine, Jeff Wilson, from the Northeast Wetland Restoration. And he has this idea that if you mow the hay and you put the hay inside the ditch, and then this is just twine, baling twine that's holding it in place, that this will actually trap enough sediment that the plants will grow in, and it will actually heal the ditch from the bottom and the side in. So we wouldn't get any change in porosity. This is peat that's been built from the bottom up. And we looked at that, we took some elevations, and yep, sure enough, you do the project, and over a couple of years, it's getting shallower and shallower. Depending on how wide and how deep is that, summertime, one treatment will get us there. Sometimes you have to do multiple treatments, but it seems to be working really well. We're like, wow, this is really cool. Now what do you do with it? So this is actually not happening on the refuge, but Susan and Jeff are working with Ross Hoppings at Trusteo Reservation at Old Town Road. And the idea, this is one of Jeff's drawings again. His idea was that before Europeans came and we started ditching everything, there used to be this nice creek hydrology, and each creek network would drain a portion of the marsh, and the amount of water in that portion of the marsh was perfectly sized to the shape and size of that creek system. So he called these tie sheds, just like watersheds. And these were self-maintaining, and they would grow and shrink as water changed. But then we came in and we put in all these ditches, and the ditches captured the water, and the creeks disappeared. We don't really know where the creeks were. It's really hard to find in aerial photos, but we know what the ditches were. And the ditches were being maintained for mosquito control, first for so much haying, and then for mosquito control for many years. But then in the 70s, 80s, we kind of stopped maintaining ditches because, Wetland Protection Act and all that came in, and they decided that biological control mosquitoes was better than spraying. And what happened was that a lot of these ditches started clogging, and it started ponding in a lot of the areas because they were ponding. So here is a graphic with the water is the blue is open water, this green is kind of that wet alternate flora that you get. So Jeff's idea is that even though we've lost the creek systems for the most part, if you use these large ditches that is still out there and heal, using ditch remediation to heal these other ditches in between, you can get that tie shed back, because now all this water from here is going to drain towards these few remaining ditches. and it will help to maintain the ditches and create a new altered, restored hydrology to the system, and we should be able to get rid of these pools. So this project has been designed. I believe it's in permitting. So hopefully we'll get to see if this works or not. I'm really excited about it. Another area that we see large pooling and ponding is kind of in the middle of the marsh sometimes. So this is kind of west side of Plum Island. In some areas, when you get these pooling, what happens is that these pools just keep expanding and they get bigger and bigger, and then you lose the entire marsh. You have these ditches with big pools in between and nothing else. And that's really bad because marsh grass builds elevation. Open water just causes deterioration of peat, so you're going to lose elevation if you have open water. So, so one thing I want to talk about is when you have these big pools, we talked about algae. You guys are noticing all that algae out there, and if you look at Google Earth, you can actually go back in time and see how much algae has been prevalent in the last couple of years. But this is that salt pans area again, and all those algal blooms. What happens is that during high tides, that algae gets pushed out by the tide, and it smothers that grass, and it kills it. And then you get these mud flats, and then that pool expands. So you have this pool expansion cycle that's happening. So working with UNH, we decided, well, can we reverse this process by letting these large pools kind of feed into adjacent creeks and ditches, which is something that used to naturally happen when we had the natural creeks and pools that were out there. So this was a pilot that was done in 2005. This is Dave Burdick and his grad student using a pressure press, just basically made this wedge in here. They didn't even use a shovel, and reconnected this. So this is with the algae, and then this is afterwards. You can see all the mud flats that it's draining. So we're monitoring this. We're hoping that will come back. And we've been monitoring a bunch of this, and then some of them, they've come back really quickly, and some of them is taking a bit longer. But we're monitoring elevation and plans to see what happens to these large areas. So Dave Burdick's colleague, Greg Moore, who's another professor at UNH, recently got a large grant to do a large runnel project based on that pilot. So hopefully next year sometime, we will be hitting a lot of these large pools that's out on the refuge. We are also monitoring some areas that's actually breaching on their own. We're noticing a lot of these big pools are actually going on its own as well. So we're monitoring both the ones we want to restore and the ones that's actually naturally happening to make sure that the process is the same. So I guess in conclusion, there's been a lot of alterations in our marsh. I used to think that the salt marsh is pristine. It's not. There's a lot of structure out there. And so when we're doing restoration, we're focusing on restoring the hydrology of the marsh. The marshes need to flood, but it also needs to drain. And if we break any of these cycles, then we're going to lose the marsh. So most of our restoration on the refuge is focused on restoring hydrology. And I think if we can do that, then we can make the marsh that much more resilient for it to be able to keep up with sea level rise. So right? The projections are looking pretty kind of dire, that exponentially growing. There's a bunch of models from Plum Island. I think there's like 5 models out there. I'm just going to go through one because we don't have enough time. This is the Czm model. It's a SLAM model with variable accretion. A SLAM is basically a bathtub model. You take the elevation, you add the future tidal flooding, and it tells you what you have. So it's one of the more basic models, but it's actually showing that this light green, I don't know if you can tell, is Spartina patent, so that high marsh, and this dark green is the low marsh. It's actually showing that we'll have high marsh to 2017, which I think is optimistic, but that we'll still have low marsh at least till in the year 2100. And a lot of other models are at least showing this. We have some models showing this changing like in 2040, 2050, but at 2100 at least, we still have at least low marsh. Who knows what's beyond that, but that's like way out there, and I don't like to predict anything beyond 20 years because a lot of things are changing. But that modeling confirmed kind of the LTER prediction, which is, more open water, more low marsh, less high marsh, and maybe marsh migration. We'll look at that. I'm going to skip this because I think we're a little bit low on time. This is sediment, which I think is really important, so I can come back and talk about it if you guys are interested. But there's a lot of things that's actually changing out there, and I'm excited about some of these changes. So this event, did you guys remember Northeaster Grayson in January of last year? Did you guys notice the ice chunks that were out there in the marsh? Well, so this, there was a rash of emails going around in February of January of 2018. Nobody has seen anything like this in their memory, and there's no documentation that we know of. But these huge ice rafts, which is a normal process, but they tend to be very small, came up all over the marsh. Greg Moore calls this a Oreo, sediment Oreo. You have this ice and sediment. But it deposited this huge sediment onto the marsh. And on the largest site was on the Refuge, just outside of one of our impoundments. It was about 60 acres, so that's the aerial photo. And here's one flown with the drone that Greg Moore did. So the gray is all sediment. And from the thickness and the extent, we calculated it's about 10 years worth of accretion in one weekend that got dumped. And we went back, so this was May, is all mud. We went back in August. I couldn't even see the sediment. The plants have grown completely, covered the entire area, which is pretty amazing.
So, the interesting thing about that phenomenon there is that would happen more often if the Plum Island Turnpike wasn't there, because you have a huge amount of mud flats in Joppa, which typically ices over. And you see that ice freeze to that sediment and float out and land on Plum Island or Plum Island Point, and it'll bring marsh grasses with it. That sometimes take root if it's the highland version of the marsh grass. But the turnpike is an effective barrier in keeping all that sediment in the delta area and in the basin area of the river.
Yeah, I think barriers, and I think sometimes our resistance to change is something that we have to watch out for. So, that sediment, as far as we can tell, most of those sediments at all the events came from the adjacent tidal flats, the shallow areas. There's discussion about dredging some of those areas that are shallowing, for navigation or whatever purposes. I think if there's a good reason for it, it's fine. It's just that we don't want to reverse something just because it's changing, because sometimes a change is necessary for the system to find a new equilibrium. Yeah?
Do you think reconstruction of the jetty has anything to do with this change?
The jetty is probably influencing more what's happening at the north end of the island and how much sediment is being trapped in the mouth of the Merrimack than the Plum Island Sound, and a lot of the marsh system were getting most of that water from Plum Island Sound at the south end. So that interaction is happening more through the south end than it is at the north end and through the river. Yeah. Susan, did you have a question? So what do we do? How do we address this, right? There's a lot of changes happening. How do we reduce vulnerability? So let's break down vulnerability again, right? So we can do a little bit about exposure, and we've heard a lot about carbon mitigation, and that's kind of a global problem, right? We need everybody to do a little bit of something with that. Infrastructure siting is another way to avoid exposure, in these really areas of dynamic systems. If you don't have infrastructure, then there's less issues to deal with. Sensitivity for nature you can't really change, but for built infrastructure, you can maybe, adapt a little. You can build a bigger wall or raise a road, but you have to understand that when it breaches, when it goes over that new threshold, the impacts could also be greater. So, looking at kind of green infrastructure or greenscaping. I'll talk a little bit more about greenscaping later. That's something that we can all do very easily in our home. And then adaptability, putting nature in front of built infrastructure is actually one of the best ways we can protect our infrastructure. So during Hurricane Sandy, somebody went back and looked at all the damages from Hurricane Sandy, the houses with marsh and the houses without. And the houses that have marshes in front has significantly less damage. The marsh is also really great at sequestering carbon. There's a research study that the LTER is doing that measures exactly how much carbon gets buried every year by the marsh. So I took that data and I went to an online calculator. So the marsh, gray marsh is 16,000 acres, is twice as good as forest at sequestering carbon. It can heat a lot of homes. It can let us use our cell phone guilt-free. Protecting the marshes we have is really important. And the flip side of that is think about how much peat is buried. When we lose that marsh, all that peat is going to be carbon that's going to get released in the air. It's kind of like the Arctic, tundra, right? So we don't want to release that peat. We want that peat to continue to be buried. So marsh migration. Like I said, it doesn't look like a lot. So this is a TNC model, and the Bio 2 that the state did has a very similar marsh migration map, I think with very similar lines. It doesn't look like a lot, but when you add it up, there's about 1,300 acres in Plum Island alone that, if we allow it to migrate, could migrate. Some areas I'll point out, High Street in Newberry, really great marsh migration potential and really good property values as well. The beautiful homes over there. The dam in Newberry has potential there. The Railroad and Little River also has potential. I think that's the industrial park in Newburyport as it goes up here. So there is potential for marsh migration, but we do need to be proactive. There's a lot of organizations that is trying to protect property. Greenbelt, I know, is a big one. I'm sure there's others as well. So supporting those organizations would be really important. And then, like I said, in order for our marshes to survive, we needed to get water and we needed to get sediment. And barriers in terms of roads and undersized culverts is going to be a big issue going forward. So Ipswich River, as part of the Big Sandy Grant, actually went and assessed all the tidal crossings in the watershed, not just in the coastal area, but in the watershed. And they've actually prioritized the top 100 and have preliminary designs for it. So ideally, we would build bridges like this, elevated, so that none of it's sitting in the marsh and water is flowing and sediments flowing. I know that's logistically sometimes and financially not possible, but there's a couple. So this is Kent Island. They just had a ceremony earlier today. I don't know if any of you guys went. They just finished a bridge expansion, culvert expansion. I know Agila Road is working on one. So these areas, these roads that cross marshes, if you cannot abandon it, we have abandoned one of our roads to our Nelson Island because we've just decided it's not worth maintaining for the little access it provides. But if you cannot abandon it, at least enlarging the culvert so that the tidal flow can expand will help a lot. Every town has a municipal vulnerability plan with detailed information. The part of the Sandy Resiliency Project that we got, each of the 6 towns in the Gray Marsh has a detailed adaptation plan. I bought a copy in the back, and it has really step by step, this is what we should be doing. So anything we can do to kind of help the towns prepare and think about some of these projects will be wonderful. If you guys want to go out and get hands-on and have fun, there's a couple of opportunities. These students are helping us pull perennial pepperweed, which is an invasive species. Liz Duff from Mass Audubon and I coordinate this project, and we do it all the way from Salisbury down to Gloucester. And I think last count, we've eradicated pepperweed from about 600 different areas. So it is working. We're turning the tide, but we always need more volunteers. In fact, we need more volunteers because where we used to spray, we're now pulling because we want to get every last one of these plants to get rid of them from these sites. These two up here, Peter Fippen from 8 Towns in the Bay and Alyssa Novak has been doing a green crab assessment project and a green eelgrass planting project where they need a lot of volunteers. The eelgrass planting seems to be like 5 o'clock in the morning on the weekend always. But if you're interested, you can get on their email list and they'll let you know when they need help. And I think Lisa Hutchins has been exploring dune planting, which UNH did as part of the Hurricane Sandy project. So these are all things that you can participate in. But more importantly, at your own homes or at your businesses, there's a lot you can do to try to mitigate impacts. One of the big things is flooding, right, with increased rains. And if we can get the water to infiltrate the ground quicker, that will kind of decrease that sensitivity that we talked about. Planting native shrubs and trees or planting wildflowers. Even though we have a lot of protected land in this area, it's not going to be enough to conserve the wildlife. Our private land need to be those buffers and stepping stones between these larger chunks of protected land. So if we can make our land more wildlife friendly, that will help a lot. I think that's all I have. How am I doing on time? Yeah.
Nancy, who is going to be integrating what's happening with the individual community resiliency plans and the Great Marsh plan so that you've got an ecosystem plan? How's that happening?
I don't know that it's any one person's job. I know that there are planning commissions, right? So the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission and the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission are coordinating that somewhat. A lot of the conservation organizations that helped to write that original plan were still somewhat involved, but it's an added task. We have meetings all the time to talk about that exact question, and I think it has been a difficult lift. I know each town has formed vulnerability committees. I don't know for each town how many of them are active. I know that a lot of the organizations have been focused on getting the town planners, the town engineers, the selectmen, the mayors more involved, because I think we've come to the realization that the little decisions that the towns make actually will have a lot more impact than all the stuff that we can do on protected lands, because those are the decisions that are going to affect resiliency of the system going forward. So educating, those people, and then, through meetings like this, the residents, we're going to be asking our town officials to make some really, really difficult decisions. So they're going to need support from the community to make those really difficult decisions. So, kind of that community support to do that. So I think it's a multiple pronged approach. And I think it's everybody doing what they can because we all have full-time jobs. And no one person is responsible, no one organization is responsible, I guess. Yep.
With what you're doing to try to make things better as well as how things work?
Yeah, so I have a poster back there about the Soma Sparrow, which is the sparrow that we're very focused on. So It is a sparrow that nests from Maine to Delaware, only in salt marshes, only in those high marshes. The female builds a nest. She has to build the nest, lay the egg, raise her chicks big enough to climb out of the nest in 26 days before the next high tide comes. So it's a lot of work. And as you can imagine, with these shifts in vegetation, she likes to build her nest in that kind of really nice salt marsh hay, that picnic hay grass that's really thick. And the reason why it's nice to lay on is because there's a nice thick thatch layer underneath, kind of like a mattress, you know? And that actually helps to keep the nest dry. So even when you don't lose the plant species, you lose that thatch, it affects whether or not the nests make it. So what we've been focusing on is education to the greater community, because again, you know, we're doing little things on the refuge, like, you know, the projects I talked about, like the funneling, like all the things that's converting the patents to alternate flora because of human infrastructure. We're trying to reverse those, and we're trying to make the marsh more resilient. And I'm starting a new series of little experiments to try to build higher elevation areas for them. So like for that ditch plug project that we just did, we took the sediment material and we actually built little islands, so kind of elevated islands. It's too small for the marshes, but we're trying to do a proof of concept of can you build these larger areas, allowing that like sedimentation, that big sedimentation event to happen. So I think if the marsh is more resilient, the birds have a better chance of making it. If you look at the genetics of the bird, it seems like it actually separated from its closest cousin more than 4,000 years ago before our marshes formed. So there must be some genetic adaptability in that population, and that's what I'm hoping for. They are seeing, some researchers down in New York are seeing that they're nesting in taller alternate flora, which is what one of its similar species, seasides, do. They nest in taller ones. So, you know, we're hoping for some adaptability, but we're also trying to slow the rate of change to give the birds a chance to be able to adapt. Any other questions?
During this interglacial, the start of the interglacial till present, there's been a lot of shoreline shifting. The Merrimack River course has changed quite a bit. The Delta has changed. The barrier islands that were built by the river, they must have changed back and forth too. Have there been any studies about positions and extent of these older barrier islands compared to the current Plum Island?
Which older barrier island are you referring
So
to?
the way Plum Island evolved, and Chris Hines will probably talk about it when he comes in December to an extent, but 5,000 years ago, sea level was so much lower that the Merrimack River Delta was actually out beyond Cape Ann.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, then as sea level rose and the coastal processes took over, it started pushing that sediment westward, and then it eventually formed the barrier, and then sea level rise sort of slowed, and the accumulation of sediment along Plum Island via deposition through the Merrimack and Parker Rivers was faster than any erosion could happen. So the island actually grew taller and actually started going seaward instead of continuing on its westward migration. So now we're at this sort of turning point, and there's probably going to be some debate as to what the island is doing now. The island is so tall, in order for it to start moving westward again, you need to have quite a bit of erosion on the ocean side and moving sand somewhere else to the point where waves could eventually overtop and then start pushing everything back over the marsh again. There's some evidence that that's happened because we see, especially on Salisbury Beach, which is a much lower barrier beach, at low tide, there is ancient marsh peat rising up from the seafloor. And on really low tides you can see it. And some of them, interestingly enough, actually had horse footprints in them, which tells you that somebody was riding a horse out there at one point when the island was further forward and that used to be marsh. So,
Have they been age dated?
No, because that exposure only lasted for like about a month, and they got covered up with sand again, and so I'm not sure that anybody actually captured that. There were some pictures taken. Somebody on the Storm Surge Facebook page took those pictures, and I don't know where they went because I can't find them. They got posted, but I can't find them.
Yeah, there is evidence of kind of big storm events or something that's washing over the island. So we have done P-courts on the marsh side, and there is huge sections of sand underneath the marsh. So it will be peat, sand, peat. Chris Hines will talk more about it because his thesis, he found another river that used to, so the Parker River used to go straight through the middle of the island, if you can imagine that, and go straight out to the ocean. There used to be another delta there that closed, and he was the one that found that ancient riverbed on the Plum Island. Yeah.
I was thinking about something was read a long time ago by a fellow named Bob Oldale from the USGS. He did some studies up here, shallow seismic studies and other studies. So I was just curious about whether any older marshes have been found in some of these areas that were emergent during the time periods that those older shorelines were.
Yeah, as Mike said, you know, so you had the glaciation, and then basically when the ice melted, the land rebounded. So it went up in elevation, and all of a sudden the ocean was basically out by Georgia's banks. So it'd be really hard to see if there was anything on the other side of that. But we suspect that a lot of the sand that built our barrier islands actually was brought out to the ocean through, let me see, let me go back. Because of the glaciers. So the Merrimack River changing course cut through, you know, eroded the White Mountains and then cut through all that sediment, and all that sediment got carried out and created a huge delta out in the ocean. And that's the sand that was available to build Salisbury and Plum Island and Cranes Beach. So. Yeah.
Are you seeing any temperature changes in the sense that I think it's reasonable to say that growing seasons have expanded by as much as 30 days, you know, at either end total, and also there are effects on the degree to which birds both come north and go south. Is any of that kind of stuff begun to appear?
Yeah, there's definitely, I think the growing season has definitely been extended on both directions, earlier and later. We used to do a berry phenology study on the refuge, and we have a couple of years of data that kind of show the trend. Specifically, the invasive plants seems to be taking advantage and fruiting earlier and earlier, you know, compared to some of the natives. But yeah, the growing season is definitely changing. And the LTER actually has a lot of data on that because they are, with that monitoring of the carbon cycle, they actually have precise measurements of when the marsh gets live and the plants start producing and starts sequestering. So they have like almost, you know, minute to minute how much respiration and photosynthesis is happening, and you know, so there is a lot of that data. But yeah, that's definitely happening. The birds and the others, it's a little bit harder. That's just so variable, you know, like if they don't show up here, if they show up earlier, is it because of those individuals or is it a shift, you know? It's kind of interesting. I definitely was focused a lot more on birds and insects and plants when I first got to the refuge, and I have abandoned monitoring them because by the time you see a signal in those things, it's too late. So I'm focusing on geochemistry, hydrology, salinity, you know, kind of the abiotic factors, because those things will change first and then you'll see a response in the biotic factor. And the things are changing so quickly that it'll be years, maybe a decade, before I see a change in a bird population. And that's too late. I need to know now. So I'm talking to a lot of geochemists and geologists. And we have a lot of good ones here, so it's good.
Is there a danger that the temperature-induced changes will be much faster than the kind of mitigation and, essentially mitigation that you're doing at the level of water level and all those kinds of issues? Because I think increasingly we're looking at a situation where things are not proceeding at the same speed in the same systems. And listening to you, I'm wondering whether the subtlety of what you're doing in some senses cannot be essentially overrun in the next decade by stuff that there's nothing you can do about.
I think so we are focusing a lot on processes, and we have that data mostly because of the academic research. And the reason why we focus on process instead of an end result, a bird or a habitat, is because it's hard to predict that final change. But the processes tend to be better understood, the driving mechanisms. So we're a little bit more confident that if we can focus on the process and can change or nudge the process a little bit, that we have some, so Mark Anderson is a TNC staff out of Boston, and years ago he coined the phrase, preserve the stage. That basically with climate change, it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen in the future because everything's always going to be changing. Like everything I learned in school is no longer true because things are changing. So instead of trying to manage towards something, which is what we have done in the whole conservation career, you restore nature's resiliency and function as much as you can, and you kind of take a leap of faith that nature is resilient and that nature will take care of itself if humans don't get in the way of it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to back ourselves out a little bit and let nature kind of do its thing. And I've seen some amazing resiliency in nature just in my short career at Plum Island. So that's given me, I'm probably more hopeful than most about the ability of the habitat to kind of adapt to it. Any other questions? Well, thank you guys for coming out.
All right, well, thanks for coming out tonight, and thank you, Nancy. And hope to see you all, and maybe a few others at our program in November. Have a good night.